I've always believed there's honor in simplicity. I'm Grant Monroe, the guy you'd call if your car wouldn't start on a cold morning or if you needed a favor without expecting much in return. 4 years, my life revolved around Monroe's Motors, the auto shop I built from scratch. A good day for me was when a job went smoothly, and the customers left with a smile. That's the kind of man I was, or at least the man people saw. What they didn't see was what I'd built behind closed doors. Late nights, after my kids were asleep and my wife, Leona, was scrolling through social media or flipping through magazines, I would sit at the old desk in our study, keeping tabs on my investments. Years ago, I stumbled onto something called Bitcoin. Back then, it was barely worth a dime, but something about it made sense to me. I'd always been good at spotting potential, whether it was an old car ready for restoration or an idea ahead of its time. Leona didn't think much of it. "You should stick to fixing cars, Grant," she'd say with that sharp tone that told me she thought I was wasting my time. I never argued with her. I just kept quiet and did my thing. I took every spare dollar we had, not much back then, and put it into this strange digital currency. For a long time, it didn't seem like much, but over the years, those small bets turned into something extraordinary. I'd built a fortune. $300 million, give or take, all sitting in a digital wallet that only I knew about. But I didn't tell Leona. Not because I didn't trust her, at least, that's what I told myself back then, but because I wanted to stay grounded. I wanted us to live like the same people we were before the money. I figured if the time came, I'd tell her. But Leona wasn't happy with the life we had. She used to call it simple. Over the years, that word turned into small. She'd drop hints about other people's success, showing me pictures of dream houses or fancy vacations. "We could be doing better, Grant. Don't you want more for us?" she'd ask. I didn't have the heart to tell her that more was already sitting in the palm of my hand. For a long time, I convinced myself we were fine. We had a roof over our heads, 2 great kids, Devin and Mallory, and a life most people would envy. I thought the love we shared could weather anything. But looking back, I see now that Leona had started drifting away from me long before I even noticed. And when I finally did, it was already too late. Looking back, I should have seen the signs sooner. Leona's dissatisfaction wasn't new, but I always thought we could work through it. I chalked up her sharp words and constant comparisons to stress. Life had its rough patches, right? But the cracks were more than just stress. They were a sign that she had one foot out the door. She started spending less time at home. Book club nights became more frequent, and her phone was always buzzing with messages she'd answer in another room. I didn't question it at first. I wanted to trust her, and I hated the thought of prying. I'm not the kind of man who plays detective in his own marriage. Then there were the small changes. The way she dressed, the new perfume that was too expensive for our simple life, and the fact that she always seemed distracted when we were together. I told myself not to make something out of nothing. She deserved nice things, didn't she? I wanted her to feel confident. One evening, I got home late from the shop, tired and covered in grease. Leona was at the dining table, scrolling on her tablet. The kids were upstairs. Dinner was still in the pots on the stove, cold. "You could have eaten without me," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I wasn't hungry," she replied without looking up. The silence stretched. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Instead, I sat down across from her. "How was your day?" She sighed, still not meeting my eyes. "Fine." That one word carried more weight than I was ready to handle. She didn't bother asking about my day. I didn't push her. I just got up, reheated the food, and ate alone. A couple of weeks later, I was closing up the shop when a friend, Kyle, an investigator who worked in tech, stopped by. Kyle had been a customer of mine for years, and we'd developed a friendship over time. He came in to pick up his truck, but before leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "Grant, have you been keeping an eye on Leona's social media?" he asked, a little hesitant. I frowned. "Not really." "Why?" He paused, clearly deciding whether or not to say more. "No reason. Just, maybe you should." It was an odd thing to say, but I didn't think much of it until later that night. As Leona sat on the couch scrolling on her phone, laughing at something only she could see, I felt a pit form in my stomach. Against my better judgment, I checked her social media accounts while she was upstairs putting the kids to bed. Her posts were harmless enough. Pictures of Mallory's dance recital, Devon's soccer game, and a few inspirational quotes. But it was the comments that caught my attention. One name kept popping up. Everett Carlisle. I didn't recognize the name, but he wasn't some random follower. He was leaving comments that weren't just friendly, they were intimate. A fire emoji here. A "you're glowing" there. Leona's responses were coy, just enough to keep things from being obvious. My gut twisted, but I didn't confront her right away. I needed more than a few comments to justify my suspicions. The next day, I asked Kyle to help me look into Everett. It didn't take him long to dig up some details. Everett Carlisle, Kyle said, sliding a printout across my desk at the shop. Investment broker. Real estate dabbler. Flashy guy, but he's got a reputation for being, let's just say, not very trustworthy. I scanned the printout, my chest tightening with every line. A slick businessman with $1 million smile and more charm than sense. The kind of guy who preyed on people looking for an easy way up the ladder. Kyle leaned against the counter, watching me closely. Do you think he's the reason Leona's been acting off? I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. I think I need to find out for sure. That evening, I got my answer. Leona came home late, her cheeks flushed and her smile brighter than it had been in months. I didn't ask where she'd been. I didn't need to. When she left her phone on the counter to grab a glass of water, a message lit up the screen. It was from Everett. Had an amazing time tonight. Can't wait to see you again. The pit in my stomach turned to stone. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking. Leona walked back into the room and froze when she saw me holding it. What are you doing? She asked, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I could ask you the same thing, I replied, holding up the phone so she could see the message. Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was replaced by defiance. It's not what you think, she said, crossing her arms. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice low. She didn't answer. She just grabbed the phone out of my hand and walked away. I stood there in the empty kitchen, the sound of her footsteps fading upstairs. I wanted to follow her, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the empty doorway and wonder how we'd gotten here. The next morning, I went through the motions. I got the kids ready for school, made their breakfasts, and waved them off as the bus pulled away. Leona didn't come down to help. She stayed upstairs, probably avoiding me. I didn't press her. Once the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee until it went cold. My mind kept replaying the message from Everett. The way she snatched the phone out of my hand without offering an explanation. The guilt she didn't even try to deny. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but part of me was afraid of what she'd say. So, I went to the shop and buried myself in work. Fixing cars was simple. Broken things made sense to me. People, not so much. Leona didn't bring it up that evening, either. She acted like nothing had happened. We ate dinner in near silence, the clink of forks on plates filling the void where our conversation used to be. The kids noticed. Devon, always sharp, shot me a questioning look, but I just smiled and told him to finish his broccoli. Later that night, when the kids were in bed, I finally decided to break the silence. We need to talk, I said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone again. At my words, she set it down and crossed her arms. About what? I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. About Everett. About us. Leona let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. You're making something out of nothing, Grant. Am I? I asked, my voice low but steady. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like there's something. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, I thought she might actually deny it. But instead, she stood and faced me, her chin tilted up in defiance. All right, fine. Yes, I've been seeing Everett. Are you happy now? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, struggling to process what she'd just said. She didn't look away. If anything, she seemed to double down. It's not like you've given me much, Grant, she continued, her voice cold. This life, this shop, These greasy hands of yours. It's not enough. I need more. And Everett, he can give me that. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, not out of anger but out of sheer frustration. More? I asked, my voice cracking. You think I haven't given you enough? I've worked my hands to the bone to build this life for us, for the kids. And you throw it away for some slick-talking fraud? Fraud? She repeated with a bitter laugh. Everett is a successful investment broker. He has class, ambition, everything you lack. I stared at her, the woman I had loved for over a decade, and felt something break inside me. I wanted to shout, to argue, to make her see what she was throwing away. But instead, I took a deep breath and said, if that's how you feel, then maybe you should go be with him. She blinked, caught off guard. What are you saying? I'm saying I won't stand in your way, Leona, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. If Everett is what you want, then go. But don't expect me to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. For a moment, she just stared at me, her confidence faltering. Then she squared her shoulders and nodded. Fine. If that's how you want it. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there in the empty space we once shared. I listened as she packed a bag, the sound of zippers and drawers slamming echoing through the house. When she came downstairs, bag in hand, Devin and Mallory were standing in the hallway. Mom? Mallory asked, her voice trembling. Leona hesitated, glancing at them and then at me. I'm going to stay with a friend for a while, she said, avoiding their eyes. What friend? Devin asked, his tone sharp. He wasn't a little boy anymore. He knew something was wrong. Just a friend, she said, brushing past them without another word. I wanted to comfort the kids, to tell them everything would be all right, but how could I? Their mother had just walked out, and I didn't know if she'd ever come back. As the front door closed behind her, I sank into the couch, my head in my hands. I'd done what I thought was right, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something I wasn't sure I could survive. The days after Leona left were a blur. I kept myself busy with work and the kids, anything to avoid thinking about the silence she left behind. The house felt emptier without her, though part of me hated to admit it. I'd spent so long trying to keep our family together that when she finally walked out, it felt like I'd failed. Devin and Mallory took it hard. Mallory cried herself to sleep that first night, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Devin, though, was different. He didn't cry or yell, he just shut down. He wouldn't say much to me, just short answers and grunts, and when I tried to ask how he was doing, he shrugged me off. I'm fine, Dad, he muttered, staring at his phone. But I knew he wasn't. Neither was I. At the shop, my regular customers noticed something was off. You all right, Grant? Asked Mr. Hammond, an older man who brought in his pickup for oil changes every few months. Yeah, just tired, I lied, forcing a smile as I handed him his receipt. Kyle stopped by a few times, too, not for work but just to check in. You sure you're okay? He asked one afternoon as we leaned against the counter, sharing a coffee. I shook my head. I don't know, Kyle. The kids are a mess, the house feels like a tomb, and I can't stop thinking about what I could have done differently. He took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. Grant, you did everything you could. Sometimes people aren't satisfied no matter how much you give them. I nodded, but his words didn't bring much comfort. A week later, Leona finally called. It was late, and the kids were asleep. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Grant, she began, her tone softer than it had been the night she left. What do you want, Leona? I asked, keeping my voice even. She sighed. I wanted to see how the kids are doing. They're hurt. Confused. Devin barely talks to me, and Mallory cries herself to sleep most nights, I said bluntly. There was a pause on the other end. I didn't mean for it to be like this, she said quietly. But it is, I replied. What did you expect, Leona? That you could just walk out and everything would be fine? She didn't answer, and I realized she wasn't calling to check on the kids. She was calling to ease her own guilt. Are you staying with Everett? I asked, the words bitter in my mouth. She hesitated. It's not like that, Grant. Then what's it like? I demanded. She didn't reply, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. Don't call again unless it's about the kids, I said before hanging up. The anger simmered in me for hours after that call. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat in the garage with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the faded picture of our family pinned to the corkboard. It was from a vacation years ago, back when things felt simpler. I wanted to tear it down, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The next morning, I woke up to find Mallory sitting at the kitchen table, eating cereal. Her eyes were puffy from crying, but she managed a small smile when she saw me. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, ruffling her hair. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled. Devin joined us a few minutes later, his face a mask of indifference. I tried to make small talk, asking about school and soccer practice, but he barely responded. After they left for school, I went to the garage again. I wasn't ready to face the world just yet, but I couldn't keep hiding either. If there was one thing I'd learned in life, it was that broken things didn't fix themselves. That afternoon, Kyle stopped by again, this time with news. "I've been digging into Everett Carlisle," he said, leaning against the workbench. "The guy's not as polished as he seems. Turns out, he's running some kind of Ponzi scheme. It's all smoke and mirrors, Grant." I looked up from the carburetor I was working on. "What are you saying?" Kyle handed me a folder. "I'm saying Everett's empire is a house of cards, and it's only a matter of time before it comes crashing down." I opened the folder and scanned the pages. Fraudulent investments, lawsuits, whispers of investigations. It was all there in black and white. My chest tightened, not with sadness but with something else. A spark of vindication. "Thanks, Kyle," I said, closing the folder. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a shred of control. Everett might have taken my wife, but he wasn't untouchable. If he thought he could waltz into my life and take everything I'd worked for, he was sorely mistaken. After Kyle left, I sat in the garage staring at the folder. It was all there, proof that Everett Carlisle wasn't the golden boy Leona thought he was. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction. I just felt focused. For weeks, I'd been sitting in the ashes of my marriage, feeling like a man whose life was falling apart. But this gave me a purpose. I spent the next few days piecing together a plan. If Everett was a fraud, it was only a matter of time before he got what was coming. But I wasn't about to sit back and wait for justice to take its course. No, I was going to give it a little push. The first step was subtle. I reached out to Kyle again. "You said there are whispers about investigations," I said, leaning on the counter in my office at the shop. "Yeah, SEC and FBI both have their eyes on him," Kyle replied. "Then let's make sure they have everything they need," I said. Kyle raised an eyebrow but nodded. "You got it." By the end of the week, an anonymous tip was sent to the authorities, complete with documents outlining Everett's fraudulent activities. It wasn't much, but it was enough to put him under the microscope. While Kyle handled the technical side, I turned my attention to Leona. I wasn't ready to confront her directly, but I needed to know how deep she was in with Everett. The kids would come home from visits with her, talking about the fancy dinners and the big house Everett lived in. "Mom says he's going to take us to California next month," Devin said one evening at dinner. His tone was casual, but his words hit me like a brick. "California, huh?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Yeah, he's got some work thing, but he said we could come with him," Devin continued, shoving a forkful of pasta into his mouth. Mallory chimed in, her voice quieter. "I don't like him, Dad." I looked over at her, surprised. "Why not, sweetheart?" She shrugged, staring at her plate. "He's mean. Not to us, but to other people. I heard him yelling at someone on the phone. He scares me." Her words stayed with me long after the kids had gone to bed. Mallory wasn't the type to make things up, and if she felt uneasy around Everett, there was probably a good reason. The next time Leona called, I couldn't hold back. "Devin says you're planning a trip to California with Everett," I said without preamble. There was a pause on the line before she replied. "It's not a big deal, Grant. He's just trying to include the kids in his life." I gritted my teeth. "They don't need to be included in his life, Leona. They need their mother." "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped. "It means you're parading them around with a man who's under investigation for fraud," I shot back. Her silence told me she hadn't known. "How do you? What are you talking about?" she finally asked, her voice shaky. "Everett's a fraud, Leona. Everything he has, everything he's promised you, it's all built on lies. And when it comes crashing down, he's going to take you and the kids down with him. That's not true, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Look it up if you don't believe me, I said. But don't you dare drag our kids into his mess. I hung up before she could respond. A few days later, Kyle called with an update. You're not going to believe this, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. What is it? Everett's accounts are frozen. Looks like the SEC is finally moving on him. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. Good. Let's see how he likes living without the money he flaunts. But as satisfying as it was to know Everett's empire was crumbling, I wasn't done. Not yet. When Everett's empire began to crumble, the fallout was immediate. News of the SEC investigation spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed words like Ponzi scheme and billion-dollar fraud. Everett's accounts were frozen, his investors were furious, and his carefully crafted image as a successful broker unraveled in front of everyone. I didn't celebrate though. Not yet. Watching his downfall on the news felt surreal, like seeing a storm hit from a distance, but I knew the real impact would take time to reach home. The first signs came from the kids. Devin stormed into the house one afternoon, his face red with anger. Mom said we can't go to California anymore, he shouted, throwing his backpack onto the floor. Good, I said calmly. You don't need to be around that man. You don't even know him. Devin shot back. I put my hands on my hips, taking a deep breath. I know enough to keep my kids away from him, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mallory appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bear. Mom's crying a lot, she said quietly. She said we have to leave her new house. That stopped me cold. I hadn't expected Everett's fall to hit so quickly. What do you mean, Mallory? She shifted her weight, looking at the floor. She said Everett's house isn't his anymore. She said we're going to stay at Grandma's. So it had begun. The next day, Leona called. I let the phone ring a few times before answering. Grant, she started, her voice raw. I don't know what to do. What's going on? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. It's Everett, she said, her words spilling out. They froze all his accounts. The house, the cars, everything's gone. The kids don't understand what's happening, and I don't know what to tell them. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. She sounded lost, broken in a way I'd never heard before. But then I remembered how she'd looked at me the night she left, full of defiance and certainty that Everett could give her the life she deserved. Tell them the truth, I said simply. There was a long pause. Can we come back? She asked finally, her voice trembling. Just until I figure things out? I tightened my grip on the phone, the anger I'd been holding back rising to the surface. Come back? After everything you've done? After you tore this family apart for that fraud? Please, Grant, she whispered. The kids need stability. The kids have stability, I said coldly. With me. She broke down then, sobbing into the phone. I didn't hang up, but I didn't say anything either. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to be the man she could lean on like I used to be. But that part of me was buried under months of hurt and betrayal. When she finally stopped crying, she asked, What do you want me to do? I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders. You're going to fix this, Leona. You're going to tell the kids the truth about why we're in this mess. And you're going to take responsibility for your choices. And after that, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for her. Leona did as I asked. Sort of. A few days later, she sat down with Devin and Mallory in her mother's cramped living room and told them that Everett had made some mistakes, and that things would be different from now on. I wasn't there, but Devin came home furious. She didn't even explain anything, he shouted, pacing the living room. Just said Everett wasn't around anymore and that she's staying with Grandma. What's wrong with her, Dad? I sat on the couch, watching my son pace, his frustration boiling over. Devin, I started, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes people don't tell the whole truth because it's too hard for them to admit their mistakes. He stopped pacing, crossing his arms. You mean like how she chose Everett over us? The bluntness of his words hit me like a hammer. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. That night, as the kids slept, I found myself in the garage again, sitting at my old desk with the folder Kyle had given me. The evidence of Everett's fraudulent empire was spread out in front of me, a roadmap of deceit. He'd conned investors, manipulated markets, and left a trail of financial ruin in his wake. But it wasn't enough for me to watch him fall. He needed to feel what it was like to lose everything, just like he'd made others feel. The next step in my plan was risky, but I didn't care. Kyle and I put together a package of information and sent it to every major news outlet in the region. Anonymous tips had brought Everett to the attention of the authorities, but public exposure would finish the job. Within days, Everett's name was everywhere. News anchors dissected his schemes, interviews with angry investors filled the airwaves, and his face was plastered across every channel. It wasn't long before his carefully curated image of a successful businessman was replaced with that of a greedy con artist. Leona called me again, this time in a panic. "Grant, did you have something to do with this?" she asked, her voice frantic. "With what?" I asked calmly. "With Everett. His name is everywhere. The news, social media, they're tearing him apart." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "He brought it on himself. Leona. You don't get to steal from people and walk away clean." "But the kids, they're asking questions I can't answer," she said, her voice cracking. "What do I tell them?" "You tell them the truth," I said firmly. "That Everett was a liar and a thief. That he cared more about money than about them. Or you." She didn't respond, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "And what about us, Grant?" she asked after a moment. "Is there a chance we could?" "No," I said, cutting her off. "You made your choice, Leona. Now you have to live with it." She started to say something else, but I hung up before she could finish. The next week, I saw Leona for the first time since she'd left. She showed up at Monroe's Motors, looking like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes were plain, and her eyes were puffy from crying. "I need your help," she said, standing in the doorway of my office. I crossed my arms, leaning against the desk. "Why should I help you?" "For the kids," she said, her voice trembling. "They need stability, Grant. And I can't give it to them right now." I studied her for a long moment, the anger I'd been holding onto simmering just below the surface. "You didn't care about stability when you walked out that door," I said coldly. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the man I used to be, the man who would have wrapped her in his arms and told her everything would be okay. But that man was gone. "I'll help," I said finally, my voice hard. "But on my terms." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. I opened a drawer and pulled out another folder, this one filled with documents Kyle had prepared. "You're going to publicly denounce Everett. On the record, on camera, for everyone to see. You're going to tell the truth about what he did and how you were complicit." Her face went pale. "Grant, I can't." "You can," I interrupted. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure the authorities know exactly how involved you were." The silence between us was deafening. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Good," I said, setting the folder on the desk. "You've got one chance to make this right, Leona. Don't waste it." As she left, I felt the weight of what I'd done settle on my chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about setting things right, for me, for the kids, and for the life I was determined to rebuild. Leona kept her word, though I could see every step of it crushed her pride. The press conference was held in the conference room of a small law office downtown. It wasn't the kind of spectacle Everett would have orchestrated, no flashy lights or polished speeches. Just a plain podium, a few cameras, and the weight of her choices on full display. As I watched from the back of the room, Leona stepped up to the microphone. She looked fragile, smaller somehow, as if the events of the past month had drained the fire from her. The reporters in front of her whispered among themselves, waiting for the show to begin. "My name is Leona Monroe," she started, her voice trembling but clear. "And I'm here to tell the truth." She spoke about Everett, about how she had been drawn to his promises of wealth and sophistication. She admitted to knowing about some of his questionable practices but turning a blind eye because she wanted to believe in the life he offered. She painted herself as a victim, but she didn't shy away from her own culpability. "I made a mistake," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. I believed in someone I shouldn't have. And in doing so, I hurt the people who mattered most to me. My children, my family. The room was silent by the time she finished. One of the reporters raised a hand, breaking the stillness. Mrs. Monroe, do you believe you'll face legal consequences for your involvement? Leona glanced at me in the back, a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. I'm prepared to face whatever comes, she said, her voice steady. As the reporters began to pack up, I stepped outside, unable to watch any longer. Seeing her up there didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. It felt hollow, like watching someone drown and knowing you could have thrown them a rope but chose not to. Leona called me that evening. I didn't answer at first, but when she called a second time, I picked up. Grant, she started, her voice hesitant, I did what you asked. I told them everything. I saw, I said simply. There was a long pause on the line. What happens now, she asked. That depends on you, I replied. You've taken the first step, Leona, but this doesn't fix everything. It doesn't fix what you did to me, to the kids. I know, she whispered. But I want to try. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The anger I'd felt for so long wasn't gone, but it was dulled, replaced by something heavier. We'll see, I said finally. The days turned into weeks, and the fallout from Everett's downfall continued to ripple through our lives. The kids struggled with the change, especially Devin, who had once idolized the man. Mallory stayed close to me, her quiet presence a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. Leona stayed with her mother, trying to rebuild some semblance of stability. She started working at a local diner, a far cry from the life she'd envisioned with Everett, but she never complained. At least, not to me. One evening, she came by the house to see the kids. Mallory hugged her tightly, but Devin stayed in his room, refusing to come out. He'll come around, I told her as she sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying. Will you? She asked softly, her gaze meeting mine. I didn't answer. Instead, I got up and started clearing the dinner plates from the table. Meanwhile, my plans for Everett weren't finished. Kyle kept me updated on the legal proceedings, and I made sure every piece of evidence we uncovered was sent to the authorities. But my final move came when I learned that Everett's foreclosed mansion was going up for auction. It was an opportunity one couldn't resist. I bought the property for a fraction of its value, and within weeks, it was transformed into something new. A homeless shelter named Monroe Haven. The grand opening was a spectacle. News cameras captured every moment as I cut the ribbon, surrounded by staff and volunteers. Leona was there too, standing off to the side with Mallory. Devin hadn't come. As the cameras flashed, I couldn't help but glance at her. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Gratitude. The shelter became a beacon in our community, a symbol of second chances. And in a way, it gave me one too. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, building something good out of the wreckage. But as satisfying as it was to see Everett's empire crumble, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Finding a way to rebuild the trust I'd lost with my children, and maybe, just maybe, finding closure with Leona. After the opening of Monroe Haven, I threw myself into the work. The shelter wasn't just about giving people a place to sleep, it was about giving them a fresh start, the kind of second chance I wished I could offer Devin and Mallory. But while the shelter thrived, things at home remained strained. Devin barely spoke to me. When he wasn't in school or at soccer practice, he locked himself in his room, headphones on, the faint sounds of video games leaking through the door. Mallory, on the other hand, stayed by my side. She'd sit at the kitchen table doing her homework while I cooked dinner, or she'd tag along to the shop, watching quietly as I worked. One evening, as I flipped through bills at the kitchen table, Mallory looked up from her math worksheet. Dad, she asked, her voice soft. Yeah, sweetheart. Do you still love Mom? Her question stopped me cold. I set the bills aside, leaning forward to meet her eyes. Why do you ask? She shrugged, fiddling with her pencil. I don't know. She says she's sorry a lot. And I think she wants us to be a family again. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I'll always care about your mom, I said slowly. She's your mother, and she'll always be a part of our lives. But some things are hard to fix. Mallory nodded, though she didn't look convinced. I think Devin blames you, she said quietly. Blames me for what? For everything. For her leaving. For Everett. For us not being a family anymore. Her words cut deep, but I forced a small smile. Devon's angry. Mallory. And sometimes, when people are angry, they don't know where to put it. But one day, he'll understand. I hope so, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A week later, I decided it was time to talk to Devon. I found him in his room, hunched over his desk, his headphones around his neck. When I knocked on the door, he didn't even look up. Devon, I said, stepping inside. We need to talk. About what? He muttered, clicking away at his keyboard. About everything, I said, pulling up a chair beside him. He sighed, finally turning to face me. What do you want me to say, Dad? That I'm fine? That I'm okay with Mom leaving and everything falling apart? No, I said evenly. I don't want you to say anything you don't mean. I just want to know how you're feeling. He stared at me, his jaw clenched. You want to know how I feel? I feel like you didn't fight for her. For us. His words hit like a punch to the gut. Devon, You just let her leave, he interrupted, his voice rising. You didn't try to fix it. You just gave up. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own emotions in check. It wasn't that simple, Devon. Your mom made choices. Choices that hurt this family. And I couldn't stop her from making those choices. But you didn't even try, he shouted, standing up. You just let her go to him. I stood too, my voice firm but calm. Devon, I loved your mom. I loved her with everything I had. But love isn't enough when there's no trust. She broke that trust, and I couldn't keep our family together on my own. For a moment, he just stared at me, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then he turned away, sitting back down at his desk. Whatever, he muttered, putting his headphones back on. I left the room, feeling like I'd just lost a fight I didn't even know I was in. That weekend, Leona came by to see the kids. She looked better than she had in weeks. More put together, like she was trying to show me she could handle things on her own. Devon's in his room, I told her when she asked where he was. She nodded, heading upstairs, but Mallory stayed in the living room with me. She's trying, Mallory said, watching her mom disappear up the stairs. I know, I said, though the words felt hollow. When Leona came back down, she hesitated by the front door. Grant, she said quietly, glancing at Mallory. Yeah, can we talk? Alone. I nodded, following her outside. The evening air was cool, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. She crossed her arms, looking down at the porch steps. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Which part? I asked, leaning against the railing. About fixing things. About taking responsibility, she said, finally meeting my eyes. I want to do that, Grant. For the kids. For us. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Leona, you can't just say you want to fix things and expect everything to go back to normal. I know that, she said quickly. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I want to earn your trust back. I studied her for a long moment, the memories of our life together flashing through my mind. The good, the bad, the moments that had brought us to this point. You want my trust back? I asked finally. She nodded. Then prove it, I said, my voice firm. Not with words, Leona. With actions. Show me you're serious. She hesitated, then nodded again. I will, she said softly. I promise. As she walked back to her car, I couldn't help but wonder if she meant it, and if it would ever be enough. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm. Monroe's motors stayed busy, the shelter thrived, and the kids adjusted to our new normal. Devon started speaking to me more, though his words were still clipped, and the occasional anger flared. Mallory remained my shadow, a constant source of quiet comfort. Leona kept her word, at least so far. She stayed away from Everett entirely, got a steady job at a nearby bank, and made an effort to be present for the kids. She volunteered at Monroe Haven, not for appearances but because she wanted to help. The shelter was her way of proving that she wasn't the woman who'd thrown her family aside for a fantasy. One evening, after a long day at the shop, I walked into the living room to find Leona sitting with Mallory on the couch. They were giggling over an old photo album, the sound unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "Hey," I said, setting my keys on the counter. Leona looked up, her smile faltering slightly. "Hey." Mallory grinned and waved me over. "Dad, look at this one. Mom says you used to have hair." I chuckled, taking the album from her hands. "Used to," I admitted, pointing to a picture of us on our honeymoon. Leona and I were standing on a beach, sunburned and laughing. It felt like a lifetime ago. For a moment, the three of us sat there, flipping through the pages and sharing memories. Devin came down the stairs, stopping when he saw us. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone suspicious. "Just looking at some old pictures," I said, patting the spot next to me. He hesitated, then sat down, glancing at the album. "I remember that place," he said quietly, pointing to a picture of our family at a theme park. "It was your first roller coaster," I said, smiling. "You were so scared, but you loved it after the first drop." "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It wasn't much, but it was something." Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Leona stayed behind to talk. "Thank you," she said softly, standing by the door. "For what?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "For letting me be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve it, but you're trying," I finished for her. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am, Grant. I'm trying." I studied her for a long moment, the anger and hurt that had defined our relationship for so long fading into something quieter. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. "I see that," I said finally. She smiled, a small, hesitant thing, but it was real. Life didn't magically return to the way it was. It couldn't. Too much had been broken, and some pieces couldn't be put back together. But bit by bit, we built something new. Devin and I started going to his soccer games together, and Mallory became my helper at the shelter, handing out meals with a proud smile. Leona and I worked out a way to co-parent, and though we weren't together, we found a way to be a team for the kids. As for Everett, he disappeared from the headlines, swallowed by the legal battles that would likely consume the rest of his life. I didn't think about him much anymore. He was just a chapter in a story I was finally ready to close. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mallory came outside and climbed into my lap. "Do you think we'll ever be a family again?" she asked, her voice small. "We are a family," I said, kissing the top of her head. "Maybe not the way we used to be, but we're still a family. And we always will be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope.